Thank you very much, Annette, Maureen, and everybody else, and particularly my lovely audience in such difficult circumstances. I really appreciate the fact that you've come here tonight in person, but I understand you will have an opportunity to see the event again because it will be videoed. I'd like to point out that this is a very visual evening. We've worked very hard to prepare some rather lovely slides for you. Some are unknown, and they're certainly not in the public domain. So a visual presentation, essentially based on the book Wenlock Abbey, which Maureen has just referred to, and copies will be on sale at the end of the talk at the special price of £10 for this evening. If you'd like to, so you can read further about the events. The structure of our talk is essentially in two parts: places, people. And we will start with places. And my colleague and friend, William, and I will be taking it in turns. William particularly talking about his childhood home of Wenlock Abbey in Shropshire. So I will begin by setting the scene of Wenlock Abbey. Maybe we can point, you can see whereabout. Wenlock Abbey is situated in the borough of Wenlock. The borough of Wenlock is an area around the town of Much Wenlock, because you have also Little Wenlock and various Wenlocks, but the borough is called Wenlock, and the abbey is called Wenlock Abbey. I'll show you a few slides of the beautiful market town of Much Wenlock, and I hope maybe some of you already know the town. I hope so. Yes, good. And maybe those who don't will feel inclined to go there. It's really a beautiful town, a beautiful English town with these lovely black and white houses that you can see, and this memorial hall, which is now a little museum. It used to be a cinema and various things. And you see that's before it became the museum that it is today. And on the right, you can see the black and white houses. In fact, under the arches is the Guildhall, which is still there, and you can visit it. If you go down that street, and you see the church, and you can see the spire. Now, that spire collapsed in the 1930s, so that helps us to date some of the photographs. If you just go down that street to the church, and this is the church as it is now, and you'll see no spire. It's a Norman foundation, a beautiful church. You go past that church and you turn right, and you will, a few yards along, you will come to Wenlock Abbey. And there is a very fine aerial view. It was taken by a newspaper photographer, and maybe William is pointing to the church, the top. You can see the proximity of the church to the abbey. It's just round the corner. And the various buildings. And we'll be taking a tour of those buildings in a moment.
This is my great-great-grandmother's best-known book. It's full of lots of fairly fanciful local history, but also quite a lot of interesting description of the abbey that she lived in. First thing I'll do is just take you round the place. The Milnes Gaskell family were actually a Yorkshire family. They came from Wakefield. And they settled here, or they used this as their summer home only. They had a big house in Wakefield. And they loved this place, and they are all buried here, not in Yorkshire. Around 1540, this is what the abbey looked like. This is just at the moment that Henry VIII decided to dissolve it, get rid of it all. It nearly survived. Henry VIII's court jester was a man called Will Somers, who had been choir boy at Wenlock, and his father had been choirmaster, and he tried to persuade him to create a new diocese of sort of Chester, Hereford combined, and make this the central cathedral, but it didn't work. So this was all destroyed. By 1940, that is what is left, and that's, in fact, by about 1750, it had got to that stage, having been carted away a lot of the stones to build houses in Wenlock. The part that I lived in was this bit here, which is the second cloister, the infirmary cloister. It was built in about 1430 by a wealthy prior who fancied his high living more than perhaps he should have done. And it was sold immediately after the Reformation, after the dissolution, to a man called Agostino, who had been the doctor to Cardinal Wolsey. And he had spied on Wolsey and provided intelligence to Henry VIII prior to Wolsey's downfall. And as a reward, he was sold Wenlock after the dissolution at a knockdown price. And he sold it a couple of years later to a local Shropshire family based in Wenlock called Lawley. The family eventually became Baron Wenlock. And they moved into it at the end of the 16th century and early 17th century, lived there. And then it descended, it was sold a number of times, but always to a relative of some sort. These two images here show you the main monastic layout quite neatly. You have the main church in the form of a cross. You have the main cloister. This is the first cloister, with a chapter house hiding just in there. And then this is the second cloister. This is where the monks slept. This is a special building here that was built for Henry III, who was a regular visitor to the abbey. And these were his apartments, supposedly. We're not quite sure about that, but they have actually survived. They're actually still there in the present day, or at least part of it is. This section here is still there. That range went, the refectory there went, these buildings have all gone, and most of the church has gone. But this area, which was a later part, consists of two wings. This wing here is Norman, and this wing here is built, originally thought about 1480, but new dendrochronology dating has put most of it to 1430. It fell into considerable ruin. It was always on the edge of wealthy families' estates. By this date here in the 18th century, it had become part of the Winstead estate, the William's Wynn family in Wales, who owned enormous amounts of land. And as a result, it did not get rebuilt, converted, knocked down, turned into whatever was fashionable of the day. And that's one of the most interesting things about it, is that it has largely survived intact, the architecture from what was there in about 1540, what's left. There it is, the same section in about 1865, by which time the Milnes Gaskells were here. It was very cold, it was very drafty, but in the summer they lived here and they loved it. This is about 1950s. This was a photograph taken for Country Life in the very early 1960s, I think. And it shows you the sort of well-known view of it. And in particular, it shows you this wing here, which was the prior's lodgings. And the very special feature is this double gallery at the front with the two big rooms in that section up there. It's divided in the middle there. And this one here is the main Abbot's Hall, accessed from the corridor there, and there is a corridor running into rooms underneath as well, which we'll have a look at in a minute. There it is again, a bit closer. You can see this wing here is Norman. And there is thought to have been a Norman building under all of this, which was knocked down or rebuilt. No one is quite sure. There it is in 1880, showing that these two wings in the layout. And this actually, there is Catherine and Charles, my great-great-grandparents, about a couple of years after their marriage. And there's another figure there, and I don't know who he is, standing there. I have a lot of photographs and paintings done by people in the 19th century in various albums that were assembled by Charles and Catherine in the late 19th century. And so I'm going to show you some of them. It's nice that we have some paintings by quite well-known artists. Frances Stockhurst Acton was a local Shropshire artist, did lots of pictures. She wasn't a great artist, I think, but she painted all over Shropshire, and her paintings are a very interesting record of the state of buildings at that time. And here you have the chapter house there, and behind it the part that I actually lived in. And then you can see there it is again, with its 17th century additions. That tower, this little building here, which is now gone, and this building here, which is also gone, were 17th century additions. They're not monastic. I'll now go quite quickly through a lot of pictures, just showing you around the outside of it. That's the other side of the thing. You can see these are all open at this point in 1865. This room up here actually became our nursery. It's where my younger sisters spent the first 6 months of their lives with our nanny. There you can see that's moving around the building, showing the back of the prior's lodgings. It's an extraordinary building with a number of architectural oddities that are not really explained. Architectural historians, when they start looking at this, think, well, that doesn't quite work, that's odd, why is that? And nobody really has any answers to these questions. This is a painting I inherited by William de Wint of Wenlock. And quite a lot of artists visited here. Turner, there are two paintings by Turner of it, which my uncle has. There's paintings by Cotman, and quite a number of other interesting, and a lot of minor pictures. Edward Duncan, I have a nice oil by Edward Duncan of Wenlock. This is unknown, we don't know who that is, but it shows you the state of it at that time. And this Norman wing was definitely in quite a poor state for a while, with this great tree out of it. And here is a picture, 1865, with the seated person is my great-great-great-grandmother, Mary Williams Wynne, who it was her family that owned it, and she married James Milnes Gaskell, and that's how it came through to the Milnes Gaskells. You can see the very nice Norman front door, though actually we use this as the front door because it moves in to that corridor, which is the ground floor corridor, showing you all the access to all the rooms on the ground floor. And this is the ambulatory on the first floor. And this is it's a very unusual design, this. There's nothing really comparable to it in architecture of the 15th century. And it leads into the large rooms. This is the main abbot's hall. This is a painting done at the very end of the 18th century with these mysterious frescoes which are not known. They were painted over. Were in a very bad shape. And unfortunately, my great-great-grandfather put a door there into the room next door, which is the other side. This was actually, when I was growing up, this was a dining room sometimes, but it had a ping-pong table in it. And the room on the other side was the billiard room. So they were just the ping-pong room and the billiard room. There was in the abbot's time a big stone central fireplace, which was actually quite old-fashioned by that time in the 15th century. There's a massive great tree trunk underneath that. The room underneath, which was our breakfast room, it wasn't huge, and it had a massive great pillar, a wooden tree trunk pillar, underneath there, just sitting in the middle of the room, and that was holding the stone fireplace, which has all been removed. And you can see a gap in this wonderful roof, these very ornately carved wooden timbers, which you can see in an actual photograph there. This gap here is that there would probably have been, but no one is sure, a turret on top of there to take the smoke and draft from this central fireplace out. But there's no trace of that, so no one is really sure what happened, and that was obviously removed immediately after the dissolution when it became a domestic residence. This is the same room but viewed from the other way around. This is from about the 1950s with a Williametti, that is the two Williams Wynne sisters. We'll look at this painting in a moment. Up at the top there is a little spy hole and a spiral staircase here that goes up to a room up there or down to a room underneath. And my great aunt says when she was a girl, her parents, Charles and Catherine, used to have balls in here, and she would be allowed to sort of spy on them from the little spy hole at the top there. This spiral staircase here going down is one of very few that is actually a double spiral staircase. There are two that they actually wind round each other. Only for between the ground floor and the first floor. It's then an ordinary single spiral staircase for the going up there. And that's because just the other side of that is the herbalist's room, and there was a completely enclosed pair of rooms for the herbalist, so that he could live entirely independently during epidemics or plague or whatever. During the monastic times, he could have his rooms completely separate and move down this spiral staircase, never meet anybody else. The little cubby holes through the walls to hand out medicines. He had his own door to the outside where he had his little herb garden. And that's all survived pretty much there with all the original cupboards and wood. You might recognise the same room from a film John Cleese called Clockwise. They filmed all of that in 1985. They filmed quite a lot of them. The monastery that he ends up in is located in around Wenlock. John Cleese had a bath in our ironing room, which was turned into his bathroom. This is from Lady Catherine's book, Spring in a Shropshire Abbey, and that is the second room. This is that's you can just see the edge of the billiard table there. This is the second room, and these elaborate windows here, very ornately carved, and with these things here which are too high to be seats. And it's thought they did illumination on them, but I don't think that's very accurate. Nobody really knows why they're there, but they're in all of the windows all the way down the side of the building. Right, we'll come to the people.
I'll just say a couple of words just so that you get a bit of variety. We're now moving on to people, as you can see, and we have put on the slide the main characters, the focus really of the book. The top right, James Milnes Gaskell, and on the left, his wife Mary. Now, James Milnes Gaskell was born in Yorkshire, from a Yorkshire family, partly Yorkshire and Lancashire, from the mother's side, the Brandreth and the Gaskells. And there are lots and lots of Gaskells. If you look in the directory, you often see that name. It's very, very, very common. So James Milnes Gaskell, the head, the portrait, part of a portrait by his wife. She was also quite a talented artist. And the James Milnes Gaskell bought Wenlock Abbey and the estate. That is to say, much of the town of Much Wenlock that you saw, and many, I think I'm right in saying thousands of acres of land around. So that was the estate. That was in a dreadful state that you can see from some of those pictures. You saw the ruins. And he purchased it in 1857, which was why in the title of the book I had to try and decide on a start date and a finishing date. So it's Wenlock Abbey, 1857, because James Milnes Gaskell purchased it in 1857. Then,
He purchased it from his wife's cousin.
Yeah.
This is Mary.
The Williams Wynne family, who again were great landowners, particularly of much of Wales, the Williams Wynne family, who had a country home near Wrexham in the north of the county. And there you have the other two main characters. Will has already mentioned several times Lady Catherine, your great-great-grandmother, is that right? Great-great-grandmother, and she will figure among the important people. That's a very, very beautiful painting by an artist we know virtually nothing about. Come to that in a moment. And her husband, Charles Milnes Gaskell. So you have, in our publicity, we mentioned politicians who'd lived at Wenlock Abbey. Well, here are two politicians. At the top, James Milnes Gaskell, who was studying at Oxford, at Christ Church, Oxford, which was John Ruskin's college, and he left Oxford early because he wanted to go into politics. That was in his blood, and it remained the case until he died. He was a politician through and through, and he became one of, if not the youngest MPs in the House at the age of 22. Became an MP at the time of the Reform Act of 1832. And this forthcoming Reform Act was the reason why he wanted to leave Oxford and really immerse himself in politics. He knew the Act was a very important moment in political life. So, politician, and his son, Charles Milnes Gaskell, also a politician, alas, not for the borough of Wenlock, although he tried many times. He tried to be an MP, he tried to get a seat on many occasions, and he failed until at the end, near the end, he became, under another Reform Act, where there was a seat at Morley, near Leeds, in Yorkshire, and he became the first MP for Morley, Liberal MP. So you can see that politics runs through, and in Lady Catherine's family as well. Shall I stop there, Will?
Mary's father was Charles Williams Wynne, and he was a minister and an MP. He was quite a senior figure.
That's right.
And they were looking for someone to become MP for Wenlock, and James happened to be around at the right time. James was very precocious politically, a great follower of Canning in particular. Mm-hmm. He was at Eton with his two closest contemporaries, were Gladstone and a young man called Arthur Hallum, who died quite young but was a very promising poet. And Hallum is the object of In Memoriam by Tennyson. He was very close to Tennyson.
Which was on the subject of the radio. I think last Sunday afternoon I was listening to In Memoriam, thinking about Hallum and James and so on.
This rather complicated mess, which is in the book, shows you here, there's James and there's Mary Williams Wynne. James is descended from this Yorkshire family. They were wool merchants, trade, but successful in Manchester at first, and then they moved to Wakefield. And the Gaskell and the Milnes Gaskells, quite a complicated group. But he was young and successful. Mary Williams Wynne from this ancient, rather strange family from Wales, and there's Charles Williams Wynne and Mary Cunliffe, who was the daughter of Sir Foster Cunliffe, who had made a large amount of money, which is a rather unfashionable thing to say these days, in the slave trade. Their family had, he hadn't, in the 18th century. And he was one of the largest dealers through Liverpool. James and Mary married, and their oldest son, here's the next generation here, their oldest son, who I put over here, is Charles. And he marries in 1876 Lady Catherine. So these are the four that we're really interested in, though other people feature. And they are actually related to each other, Charles and Catherine. They're both descended from George Grenville, who was Prime Minister in the 18th century, and Elizabeth Wyndham. through different daughters, Grenville daughters, one of whom married William Swynn and the other married Earl Fortescue, and then down through them. Lady Catherine is the daughter of the Earl of Portsmouth and Evelyn Herbert, who was the daughter of the Earl of Carnarvon. And they were all quite sort of unusual and interesting people, and they had an enormous family, huge number here of Lady Catherine's brothers and sisters. And they were all over the place. And one of them, interesting, Rosamond, married Augustus Christie, and I think their son set up Glyndebourne. But they were an interesting lot all over the place. Charles's sister Cecil, she married Francis Turner Palgrave, who put together the Golden Treasury, and they were a sort of interesting lot. I'm here. I'm in this lot here down the bottom. The Wenlock was inherited by, in a very complicated way. I'll allude to that towards the end, how that happened. It was complicated. Quickly, there's Mary, and there is James. There is James painted in 1832. This is a detail from the enormous picture of the whole of the House of Commons in 1832 by Hayter. Charles was a very sort of grand northern Yorkshire figure. He was on the Yorkshire Council for a long time, as well as MP for that. And his first relationship, Cynthia's going to talk about.
Well, this is the title. I think I thought of the title of the chapter, A Marriage Manqué, and Will suggested, or A Lucky Escape, because this was before he met Lady Catherine, whom he married in 1876. We doing quite a lot of research and looking at the letters in Boston, in the Massachusetts Institute of Technology Library, the archives there. We came across a lot of unknown material, which I've written about in the book, in the chapter. And we saw in the newspapers that there was this announcement of an engagement and a forthcoming marriage of Mr. Charles George Milnes Gaskell to Lady Mary Harvey, Harvey family from Suffolk, the Earl of Bristol family. And I delved into this, and I found that almost on the eve of marriage, she dumped him. I really use the expression, she dumped him. He was jilted. And she was rather a capricious lady, very, very, very spoilt.
Yeah, she never married, actually.
She never ever married. She lived a long life, but I say, was it a happy one? In my note.
He escaped, I think.
So it was like escape. So what you will see after that, the bachelor years and the wilderness. For about 10 years, Charles travelled around in France, Sicily, and so on.
It wasn't a suitable match, I think. No. I mean, to be honest, in the family, we never knew about this at all. My grandmother never mentioned it. Nobody really knew. I think it was excised from the family history quite quickly. But Charles had been a contemporary at Eton of Lord John Harvey, and they'd been very close. And he was the older brother of Lady Mary. So I think that's possibly there was some sort of connection there, and it may have been a follow-on from a very close relationship at Eton. Charles then spent 10 years having a fine time. He lived at Wenlock much more, and James had not lived there very much. They'd summered there. Charles began to turn it into a house where he could actually live in it properly, and he began to work on it. And I should say at this point, one very unusual thing about Charles is that he wanted to preserve ancient buildings. He did not do the sort of Victorian thing of wanting to turn everything into a sort of massive, great imitation. He said he wanted to preserve it in a proper way that we now completely recognise, but at the time was absolutely not what you were considered to do. But they had a massive, great big house in Wakefield, which is no longer there, called Thorns. So that they had nothing to prove in that sense. So this was their summer house project, and they preserved it. And he was an antiquarian and a very civilized man, and he had a great friend of Henry Adams, who was an American, and they were very close friends all their life. They met as young men. Henry Adams his father had been American ambassador, and his grandfather, I think, had been president. He's that family, the John Quincy Adams and the Adams family early on in the American history. And he was a professor at Yale, I think, a history professor at Yale. So he was also a very civilized man. And together they clearly enjoyed this project of restoring and uncovering and sorting out this very curious building, which clearly got under his skin. Here they are photographed. I do like his suit. I wish I had that. I'm very jealous of that. He was clearly quite having a decade of being a bit of a dandy, enjoying himself with his friends. Here they are again. This is a tiny bit later. There's Henry Adams is there, Marion Adams, his wife, and then there's a couple of Cunliffes here and Viscount Pollington. There they are again. This is a particularly nice photograph. I like this one. There's Charles with his dog. There they are again, draped over the ruins with Charles up there. This is the same group. These are all on the same day. Not a very good photograph. I don't have a very good copy of that. And then Lady Catherine appears on the scene. And
yeah, this is one of my favourite paintings. It's in a private collection, and I think it just shows how very beautiful she was. And certainly Henry James, he said, I'm a little in love with Lady Catherine, and I think Thomas Hardy was as well. And look at the way she's dressed, seated on that beautiful, I think it's a leather chair, do you not? And look at the background, probably one of those screens. You saw the screen in the withdrawing room earlier, one of those painted screens with the beautiful flowers and so on. So there you have the marriage, 1876, December 1876. There were 15 years difference in age between them. Lady Catherine, what did she do? What were her interests, as well as preserving the Abbey, writing, and here is a selection of her books, often based on Shropshire lore, I would say, legends and lore. Shropshire and Yorkshire stories. There's a whole lot of short stories. So Round the Wrekin, for example, that's the Shropshire stories. That's an example of some of her books. Anything?
My grandmother, I obviously didn't know Catherine. She died in 1936. But her daughter, Aunt Molly, I did know when I was young. I used to have lunch with her fairly regularly up until I was about 10 when she died. And my grandmother, who was her Catherine's granddaughter, talked about these books a lot. And they were very dismissive of them. They said they were unreadable and dreadful, which is a little bit unfair. They're full of a lot of dialect, very, very Thomas Hardy-esque, which we'll see why in a moment. But the fairy tales were produced as a fundraising exercise just after the First World War. And some of these are very difficult to read. The old Shropshire Life was apparently a lot of it was just made up by Catherine. The Greater Love, that's the only copy I've ever seen. It was produced right at the end of her writing career and doesn't seem to have actually been printed and distributed. That's the only copy I've ever seen. It's listed. I found that on eBay for very little money. We didn't think it actually existed, but...
A Nimble Thimble. I rather like that title. We're now talking about another of her interests, embroidery, but not embroidery for the sake of embroidery. And on the cover of the book, this is a detail from one of her designs. And she was very much interested in the pre-Raphaelites. So she was interested in the designs by Burne-Jones, for example, or William Morris, and she based her patterns for the embroidery upon their work. And you can see here there's a detail And these, normally, if the circumstances had been different, we would have brought for you a whole lot of items, of original items, in particular, huge curtains. This is a detail from one of the curtains that she made and embroidered. Yellow linen, heavy linen, lined curtains, oh, how many, 4 or 5 meters high, for the chapel in the Abbey. And there you have the angels, and come to the angels and you can see where she got some of the ideas from, of this Burne-Jones, the angels praising the Lord, and the subject of one of Lady Catherine's excuse me, embroideries. And this embroidery still exists, and I hope one day you'll be able to see it. If the church is open, Holy Trinity Church, Much Wenlock, it's usually open, but in the present circumstances, it's closed. This was where it used to be, and that was where it used to be. It's moved, and look at the state of it. It really is in quite a bad state of disrepair. You can barely see the design, but there it is, and that's some of Lady Catherine's work. I mean, it's very, very interesting and very historic if you looked at the surrounds of the design.
She had enormous amounts of energy.
Yes.
And was quite terrifying, I think. The old carpenter on the estate at Wenlock, when I was a boy, used to tell me about her, because he remembered when he was a boy being absolutely terrified of her. She had 2 Great Danes, which would sort of wander around with her, and she was quite a figure, and quite formidable. Charles died in 1919, and she then lived at Wenlock until she died about 1936, I think, 35.
Yeah.
Writing her books, writing endless letters, I think going sort of quietly around the bend.
So explorers and romantics.
They had a lot of interesting friends and family who visited, and they set up this lovely place, this beautiful romantic ruin, and then invited lots of people to come.
So I'm probably going to have to hurry.
Rush
Hurry.
This, I'm
we
afraid.
always have so much to talk about. It's so interesting. We always run out of time, but I hope there'll be time for questions. We're keeping an eye on the time. Some of the visitors, and as Maureen mentioned in her introduction, I write a lot about Ruskin, a lecture on John Ruskin. So I have to include John Ruskin because he was one of the visitors to Wenlock Abbey. But before the time of James or before the time of Lady Catherine, he was there in 1850. Well, that's just a reminder, an aide-memoire. So where did he work? What was particularly interesting to him and to Effie? He'd been married for 2 years when they came here. Look at this, on the right, in the middle is a sketch by John Ruskin. The original is in America. On the right, it's in the chapter house. You saw those arches, those 3 beautiful arches, those Norman arches. You go in, on the left, you've got this wall arcading, this blind arcading, and that's still there today. It's in wonderful condition. On the right is a photograph of the detail that Ruskin sketched, and on the left, can you see the one, Will, with the zigzag? That's it, right. The zigzag. He incorporated that into one of the plates in the Stones of Venice. So Much Wenlock, Wenlock Abbey is in the Stones of Venice by John Ruskin. So absolutely wonderful.
It was unrecognised until Cynthia spotted
Yeah,
it.
I've discovered it, if I may say so. Carry on. And another example of another detail that he sketched. Go on. I want to just comment on this. Well, there are so many visitors, because to produce this book, I spent many weeks, I suppose, over the years with Will, producing the inventory of the archive that William owns. And the book is based on that. So there's a visitor's book, which is absolutely fascinating. So together we transcribed this visitor's book with all the names, sometimes very difficult to decipher. And we've just given you a taste of some of the visitors, such interesting visitors. And the top right, second from the right, you can see Osborne Gordon, who was a visitor, and Henry James on the left, top left, Hardy, Stanley, Bishop, Palgrave. There are so many that we're just going to mention a couple of them. Henry James, for example, 1877. And at the bottom, we've done a clip of his signature in the visitor's book at Wenlock Abbey. And you can see that he signs it, Henry James, Jr., Jr., because at that time he was not known, he was not a famous writer. And it was really this visit to Wenlock Abbey which was the catalyst for much of his writing. He went away and he wrote an essay which was published, The Abbeys and Castles in Shropshire, for example, soon after. July the 14th, he was one of the first visitors at Wenlock Abbey after the marriage of Lady Catherine. So that's fine. Here's the state of the Abbey. Look at the state of it. Much work to be done. Yeah, we better.
That's about that date.
Press on. And Henry James wrote about these, he's lying on the grass near the stumps of the 4 central pillars that supported the tower, with the girth of approximately 12 yards of these diamond-shaped columns. He says, you may lie upon the grass at the base of an ivied fragment, measure the girth of the great stumps of the central columns, half smothered in soft creepers, and think how strange it is that in this quiet hollow, in the midst of lonely hills, so exquisite and elaborate a work of art should have arisen. So you can see that's just a taste of how inspirational this was. He stayed there for 5 days in July 1877.
He visited quite a number of times, actually, became quite good friends. And there is a pond at the back, which is quite dark and gloomy, surrounded by pine trees, with a little island in the middle. And it is thought that that was certainly one of the strong influences on him for writing Turn of the Screw. But he based it on at least Wenlock and at least one other house. Charlotte Williams-Wynne was quite an interesting, she's Mary's Williams-Wynne's sister. She was a diarist and wrote quite an interesting diary of her travels. She was very close to Lady Bunsen, and she's an interesting woman. Her accounts of Wenlock are quite terse. She basically complaining how cold it was all the time. I mean, you can see quite why at this point it would have been cold. There are the 3 of the Williams-Wynne sisters in the door. This is Mary, that's Charlotte, and Hester, Harriet Hester, she was actually called. And this painting here by William Etty is of Mary and Charlotte. It was at Wenlock. It's now in the York City Art Gallery. This is a painting I found on eBay just about a month ago, and they didn't know what it was, but it's actually painted by Mary Milnes Gaskell, 2 of her sisters, Sydney and Harriet Hester, and possibly at Wenlock. It's about the right date, actually, when they first visited Wenlock, well before James actually bought it. And there is James, painted by his wife. We've seen that picture already. Lady Catherine, now, going to the next generation, some of the interesting family members. This is her brother, who became Earl of Portsmouth. I just love these pictures. He was clearly quite a character. I mean, I think his main preoccupation was fox hunting, but he was also an MP and quite a sort of outrageous character. I think he had a fierce temper, he was a character of his day. And then we come to Thomas Hardy.
Well, I'm going to have to be really quick. 1893, and that portrait by Strang, William Strang, is exactly the right date. How he looked when he came to Much Wenlock. He wrote about his stay. It was one and only time that he visited. We liked the evenings at Wenlock after dinner, when we sat on the lawn in the starlight and told tales over the coffee, a horn lantern on the table to light our jokes, the moths flying round it and the dogs beneath. Catherine can talk the Devonshire dialect to perfection, and the darkness took away her shyness. She held forth with a humour and abandon which I did not credit her with till then.
Hardy referred to Catherine as his Tess, which sounds very flattering, but apparently he referred to quite a number of other girls in that way. But he was clearly very close with her, and Hardy stayed with Catherine's mother, at the family homes in Hampshire and Devon.
These mother.
We'll go through
Yes,
quite quickly.
just go through it quickly.
This is a couple who stayed a couple of times there. Edith Sichel was a women's campaigner. They were, and there's Emily Ritchie, and they were a couple. They were living together, and they were an open couple. Dorothy Tennant and Henry Morton Stanley. Stanley, whom we all know, of course. Of the Dr. Livingstone, I presume, fame, explorer in Dark East Africa, and his wife, Dorothy Tennant, who's quite an interesting artist. Stanley became a Liberal MP, and I think that he was networking with Charles and Catherine in the sort of liberal world, but Dorothy Tennant, I think, became quite a close friend. These are two pictures of Stanley by Tennant.
Interesting.
This woman who came a number of times, I got a few letters from her as well. She's an absolutely extraordinary person, Isabella Bird. She went all over the world, travelling endlessly. She was the first woman fellow of the Royal Geographical Society. She was admitted to the Royal Photographic Society as well. She was a great naturalist. And I mean, she has. You could spend an hour talking just about her. She's amazing. But she, here she is in China in her 60s, taking photographs way up the Yangtze River in China, and there dressed in Chinese costume. And later that year, there she is at Wenlock taking photographs as well. So she clearly got around a bit. And the contrast couldn't be greater, really. And you can see the blind arcading in the
oh, yes, you can see it.
Quite nicely there. Huh. A number of other interesting characters in the visitors' book. Took us a while to find out who they were. This guy was a confirmed bachelor. He was a friend of Henry James and quite a sort of interesting playwright, artist, poet. His father was an Armenian merchant who was killed in a duel when the boy was 4 years old. His mother was the daughter of an English admiral, which is a good start for any novel, frankly. And he visited a number of times again with Henry Adams and with Henry James. This chap, Cynthia.
Well, can I just go back to that signature? Because this was a challenge. Look at the signature above Henry Adams. Henry Adams writes very clearly, but that was a challenge in the visitor's book. For years, we thought it was Hamilton. Couldn't find that name at all, anywhere. You try and read that. I was only reading something else, and I came across, that must be the person. Hamilton Ide. So those were some of the challenges of the visitor's book. It was very hard work, actually, really hard. And I'm not sure we succeeded all. We have to go back. This is the final reference to visitors, and there were so many, as you can see. It was a real cultural hub. They welcomed so many interesting people. And I think really the criterion was really you had to be an interesting person to go there, because there's such a range of people of all kinds. And this, I love saying the name of this man, Romolo Nobile Piazzani. It just sounds so lovely, doesn't it? We know very little about him, but I've discovered that he was something of an art collector in South Kensington. He lived half of the year, at least, part of the year, in this hall, Ryton Hall in Shropshire.
Which he built.
Yes. And he lived with the vicar, the Reverend Henry Pole Fraser, the vicar of Ryton Church, that lovely little church right up on the hill, the wonderful view of Shropshire all around.
But it was a discreet relationship, but it was open.
They're buried in the same grave in the churchyard at Ryton.
Mm-hmm. So, and it confirms something that I find very interesting, that Charles and Catherine were, they were very much Victorians type of their time, but they weren't hidebound, and they weren't what we would regard as conventional Victorians. They were quite open to, they had a number of Jewish friends, Catholic friends, suffragettes, people from all sorts of world, a lot of scientists too, the Schrodinger's and Lord Kelvin visited. So they were remarkably sort of intellectually open to interesting people. They were not in the least bit hidebound. And here is further evidence of that. They put on a lot of dramas in the Abbey ruins, and that figure over there, looking not terribly happy, is my great-grandfather, Evelyn Milnes Gaskell, with these men. We're not quite sure who is who, but we have got 4 signatures in the visitor's book at exactly this date, next to this photograph, which is stuck into it. A little bit later, here they are again, acting. That's Molly and Evelyn. They're the 2 children of Charles and Catherine. And Evelyn was my great-grandfather and my aunt Molly, who had no children. She actually inherited Wenlock, not Evelyn. He inherited all the Yorkshire estates, but she had a child who didn't survive, and that was all. So the Wenlock estate went to Evelyn's daughter, Mary, who was my grandmother. There they are again, Evelyn and Molly, with the Pre-Raphaelite artist Robert Bateman. And going quickly now, this is Molly again, painted by Wantner, and Le Gros, who's quite interesting. Both these painters came to stay at Wenlock to paint these. There are Evelyn and Mary in the ruins as children. There is Evelyn with his wife, Constance, and they're a very interesting group here. Her father was Governor-General of New Zealand around 1900, and her mother was an extraordinary figure. She was another explorer, a bit like Isabella Bishop, and went on massive expeditions all over New Zealand, discovering all sorts of interesting things. And then Evelyn and Constance, she was a lady-in-waiting to Queen Mary. She was quite an sort of interesting figure, a very doughty figure. And they had 2 children, Mary, who was my grandmother, who inherited Wenlock, sort of indirectly by her aunt, and Charles Milnes Gaskell, who had a family, but he was killed. He was a diplomat doing clandestine activities during the Second World War, and he was the Russians put a bomb on his plane, and he was blown up over Egypt. This is my father at Wenlock. He's the one in the middle. You can see the altar in the background in the chapel hall, with a wonderful 12th century lectern that was dug up in the sort of 1870s, found in the ruins. It's now in the Victorian Albert Museum. You can go and see it. And in this room here, on that altar, I was christened. My mother is from a Roman Catholic family from Hampshire, a requisite Roman Catholic family that goes all the way back to the 11th century, 12th century. And my mother was always very proud of the fact that my christening, which was a Roman Catholic ceremony, was the first time that a Roman Catholic Mass was said on that altar after the monks had left in 1540. There is, I haven't got a picture of my christening. There's me at my sister's christening, which took in the same room a few years later. And I did discover that my mother's family are related to the very first people who bought Wenlock from Wolsey's doctor. So both branches of my family have a connection to Wenlock, which I was quite surprised to find. And there we have, we'll finish on a lovely picture of Wenlock in 1926. Thank you very much for listening to that.